welcome to this Cantabile walkthrough. Today I'm going to show you how to get started with Cantabile, how to install it, how to download some plugins, load them into Cantabile and get them up and running, and a couple of tips and tricks along the way. So the first thing you want to do before you do any sort of real-time audio work on a computer is make sure that it's in high performance mode. So you can do that by just clicking the start button here, typing power, and you want this option here, power options in control panel. And you want to make sure it's set to high performance mode. In these other modes, Windows will tend to put the processor in your computer to sleep, and it's really quite detrimental to real-time audio performance. So make sure you're in high performance mode. Also, if you're running on a laptop, make sure you're plugged into mains power and not running off battery, because even in high performance mode, Windows will tend to slow the processor down if you're on battery. Okay, let's go and get Cantabile installed. So if you go to the cantabilesoftware.com website, there's a couple of download links on the main page here. They will get you the latest stable build. Or you can go to this downloads link here and you'll see that there's actually two editions available. There's a stable build and an experimental build. Stable build has been more well tested. It's been released for longer. And the experimental build is often only a day or two old. Has newer features often and typically bug fixes. It's up to you which version you use. If you're going to be doing anything like live work, I would recommend the stable build. If you're just learning or you just want to play around with it, the experimental build is often a little bit newer. You'll see too that these installers include x64 and x86. So x64 is for a 64-bit operating system, x86 is for 32-bit. The 86 comes from the name of the processor that was the original Intel processors. This is a 32-bit version, 64-bit version. For Cantabile, they're both bundled into the one installer. So I'm not going to install that I'm not going to download that because I've already got it downloaded over here. So if I just run this, it's a fairly simple procedure to install Cantabile. There's no options to choose. You can see it's detected that this is a 64-bit operating system and it's saying that both builds will be installed. I'm just going to install it. Only takes a few seconds. Okay, and if I just hit finish, it'll launch Cantabile. And the first thing it will do is it'll ask you to sign up for a license. So I'm just going to use a demo account. So name and email address, click the Get Free License button. And if you go to email, you should have already received an email here, which we have. And what we're after is the license key, which is this one here. So I'm just going to copy that back to Cantabile and paste that in there. Continue. Now, when you sign up for this free license, you get a fully working version of Cantabile Lite that's completely free for anyone, and trial editions of Solo and Performer. These are the more advanced versions. I'm just going to choose Lite for now because it's got everything we need for this particular video. Okay. Next, Cantabile will walk you through setting up your audio and MIDI devices and plugins. The first step is to choose an audio driver. Because I'm trying to record this on video, I'm just going to choose this particular device and shared mode with a slightly larger buffer. I should maybe just go to here. What you want to choose here is an ASIO driver if you have one. Most good quality sound cards will come with an ASIO driver, and they're specifically designed for low latency real-time audio. So by low latency I mean minimal delay between pressing a key on your keyboard and actually hearing sound come out. Often these drivers will be better than the built-in Windows drivers. If you've got a card with one of these drivers, I recommend you use it. If not, if you're just using a standard motherboard type sound card, you might need to use one of these. These aren't particularly bad, it's just the ASIO drivers are specifically designed for this kind of work. Okay, On the next screen, we get to choose how the channels on that sound card are mapped onto these ports. Cantabile uses these ports to separate your song from the physical hardware. So rather than referencing this particular device in your song, you say, I want to reference the main speakers, and then you map the main speakers onto your actual device. So for these main speakers, I'm just going to map them onto, or Cantabile has already mapped them onto channel 1 and channel 2 on this device. The metronome, I'm just going to change this so that they're both mapped. So I'm just going to add another mapping here, or another assignment. Okay, so you can see now that the metronome signal is mapped to channel 1 and channel 2, so we can hear it on both. Okay, that's a fairly standard basic setup. The next thing we need to set up is MIDI ports. So the MIDI ports are where you connect your keyboard to your computer. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that this main keyboard is mapped to wherever your MIDI keyboard is plugged in. If I had a keyboard plugged into this Tascam device, for example, I would probably be selecting this. For this video, I'm just going to choose on-screen keyboard so that you can see what I'm doing on screen as we go through this tutorial. Here's where we choose plugins. I'll come back to this a little bit later and finish. Okay, so we're now in Cantabile. The first thing you'll notice is that each panel has one of these helper panels at the top. So just put this gain back up. These are just providing hints to help you get started. You can, if you already know how to work this, you can just get rid of it with this button. If you need more help, you can hit this Tell Me More button and it will tell you more about that particular screen with these online guides, which will work you through how to do it. I'll just close that. If you're returning to Cantabile, if you've reinstalled it and you already know how to work it, rather than go through and turn all of these off individually, you can just choose Hide All In-App Tips, and that'll get rid of them all through the whole app. Okay, the next thing we want to do is we want to check that our audio is actually working, and the easiest way to do that is with the metronome. So if you just open this metronome bar here and click this button to turn the metronome sounds on, and I'll just turn it down a bit because it tends to be fairly loud. And if we hit the play button, we should hear the metronome. Okay, so we now know that we're set up for audio, the audio output is working, and we're ready to load some plugins. So if you're new to all of this, you might be wondering what I mean when I say plugin. A plugin is simply a piece of software that you download from the internet typically, and they perform functions such as instruments, synthesizers, audio effects like reverb, EQ, chorus effects, that sort of thing. And there's a third type of plugin which are called MIDI plugins, which transform MIDI data. So for example, they might convert, playing one note into a chord or an arpeggio or something like that. There are literally thousands of different plugins. You can find them on the internet. There are free and commercial ones available. Most commercial ones have trial versions, and if you just search on the internet, you'll find them. For example, if I was to search for free VST plugins, it'll bring up a whole bunch of sites. This site here is a particularly good reference, Bedroom Producers blog. They do reviews of plugins, they have lists of best instrument and effect plugins, links to places where you can download them. Okay, the other thing you'll find when you're looking for plugins, if I just go to this Shattered Glass one, for example. So this is a simple audio effect. When you go to download them, they'll often present different options. So here it'll say, here, this one, for example, you can get in a 32 or a 64-bit version. You can also get a Mac Universal version. Because I'm running 64-bit operating system here, I chose the 64-bit version. I've already downloaded that, and we'll come to that in a minute. If you're running the 32-bit operating system, or you're running the 32-bit version of Cantabile on a 64-bit operating system, which you can do, you might download the 32-bit version. The idea with 64 and 32-bit is if most of the plugins that you want to use are 64-bit, I recommend you run the 64-bit version of Cantabile. If most of the plugins that you want to use are 32-bit only, then run the 32-bit version. And for the plugins that aren't available on the platform that you're using, there's a way you can bridge between them, although it's less efficient than if they're natively loaded in process into Cantabile. Okay, So I've already downloaded these, so let's go and have a look at those. Now I've picked a couple of different plugins here that are each packaged a little bit differently, just to show the different ways that you might install these plugins. What you want to do is you want to get these all installed into a folder on your computer. And what you want to do is you want them separated into 64 and 32-bit. So what I typically do is just create a folder in the root of C drive called VST plugins 32 and another one for 64-bit. Okay, so you can see we've got these two folders here now, and we're going to put all our plugins into here. So if I go back to this downloads folder now, and we'll start with this Brainstormer plugin. Now you can see it says here in the file name, this is a VST2 plugin. Cantabile only supports VST2 at the moment, and it's a 64-bit plugin. So this is just the 64-bit version of this. So if I open the zip file, you'll see there's this file here, brainstormer.dll. This is the actual plugin. This is what Cantabile will be looking for, and it will be looking for it in the 64-bit folder. So let's put it in there. So you can see now we've got this VST plugin 64 with this one plugin file in it. If we switch back to Cantabile now and go to Options and go to the plugin options page. This is the page I skipped over before. We need to tell Cantabile where to find these plugins. Now, I chose this particular folder. You could create your own folder anywhere you like. Maybe you've got a separate drive with a lot of storage space or a really fast drive, for example. You might want to put your plugins there. You can actually list out multiple ones as well if you want. Just put a semicolon between each one. But we're just going to do this one for now. Now, when I press OK, what Cantabile will do is it'll scan this folder. So scanning is just a process of going through all the files in that folder, figuring out which ones are plugins, and reading in a bit of information about them, such as their name, who produced them, their capabilities, so forth. So if I do this now, you'll see it run the scan. And when I click the Add Plugin button, you can see this plugin appears here now with this information that it found during the scan. Now you'll also notice here it says, so just to cover this, it's a VST2 plugin. It has no inputs. It has two outputs, audio inputs and outputs. It accepts MIDI input. That's because it's a synthesizer. It supports 32-bit audio only, and it's a 64-bit plugin. 32 and 64-bit, people get confused about these. These are completely separate things. 32-bit audio refers to the sample size, the quality of the audio being processed. 64-bit refers to the operating system that you're running on. You can do 64-bit audio on 32-bit operating system and vice versa, or the same. They're completely unrelated. Don't get them confused. Okay. Also, there's the location of the plugin, which is where we put it, and the vendor. So let's just insert this plugin. Just double click on it. This one takes a few seconds to load. Okay, so you can see we've got this plugin loaded, and also Cantabile created some connections here. First of all, it created a connection from the main keyboard, which you remember I had mapped to the on-screen keyboard, to Brainstormer's MIDI input, and then Brainstormer's stereo output is mapped to the main speakers. So if we send MIDI events to this main keyboard now, or from this main keyboard, they'll be sent to Brainstormer. Brainstormer will synthesize a sound and it will be sent to the speakers. So to do that, I'll bring up the on-screen keyboard. Just make this a little bit bigger. And if I play a note, we'll hear it. Okay. Now, it doesn't sound too good to start with because this plugin hasn't really been configured. You'll see then I just double-clicked on this to bring up the user interface for this plugin. This particular plugin is a simple 3-oscillator synthesizer. It's a great plugin if you're trying to learn about synthesis. I highly recommend this one. You can tweak these settings. It's pretty simple. So it's just, I'm not going to go into how to use a synthesizer at this stage, but if I play some notes, you can see the sound has changed. While I'm here, I'll cover off this bar at the top. This bar at the top is actually part of Cantabile. The inside part is actually part of the plugin. Most plugins have a set of presets, not all, but most. This one, for example, has 128 presets, and each preset simply stores one of the configurations out of here. So for instance, this one, I tweaked these knobs here. You see it's stored in preset 1. If I was to switch to preset 2, we're back to the default configuration, that harsh sound. Okay, and if we switch between them, you can see that the sound changes. So these presets are simply ways of storing off multiple configurations in these plugins. You can rename these presets. So for instance, this first one, I might rename it to soft, for example. And the second one, I don't know, harsh. Okay, these names are completely arbitrary. They're just whatever you want to call them. And many plugins will also come with these presets pre-populated with specially named presets already configured. This one doesn't. Okay. Also in this menu, you would have noticed these import and export commands. These can be used to import and export either the bank, which would be the entire set of presets, or a program, which would be just the currently selected preset. And you can export them and load them into Brainstorm or load it in another audio package, for example. Okay. That's that covered off. Let's go and get some more plugins. Just show how some of these ones are packaged up. So this one was specifically a 64-bit plugin. This one, it's a zip file again. And what we'll notice inside is it actually includes both the 32 and the 64-bit versions. Win32 and x86 are the same thing, 32-bit plugin. So what I'll do is I'll put those plugins, just going to drag these 32-bit one into the 32-bit folder, and the 64-bit one into the 64-bit folder. So you can see we've got both these plugins for 64-bit and just this one for 32-bit at the moment. Cover off some of these other ones while we're here. So this one is a zip file as well, but inside the zip file is an installer. So if we run this installer, it's the same sort of deal as any other installer, except you get to choose what ones we want to install. I don't want these ones. I just want the two VST2 plugins, and I want to install them to these folders. This installer knows that this is where I like them because I've run this installer before. Okay, install. And you'll see in the background here that Diva's been loaded here, and it's also available here. Okay, so that's another typical installation of a plugin. Sometimes you'll find a zip file with a whole bunch of plugins in them, like these MDA plugins. These are all separate plugins, so I can drag those to here. And so they were the 32-bit ones, 64-bit ones as well. Okay, and then finally, this is the Shattered Glass Audio plugin that I was showing you before, the 64-bit version that I downloaded. So if I just run this installer, what I tend to do when I'm installing plugins from an installer is that sometimes it's a good idea to actually put them in a subfolder. So this is the 64-bit one, so I'm going to put that here, and I'm just going to put it in a subfolder. Now the reason for this is with an installer, sometimes it's not obvious what files are going to be installed, and it's handy to keep them separate so that two plugins don't conflict with each other if they happen to have a file with the same name. So I'm going to install that one. And you'll see that this one's been installed into this subfolder with these uninstaller files here. Cantabile goes through all the subfolders, so it doesn't really matter the structure of this folder. You can organize these however you want. I could have put all these MDA ones into an MDA subfolder, for example. Okay, if we switch back to Cantabile and hit Add Plugin, you'll see that it still only knows about Brainstormer. That's because the folder hasn't been rescanned. You can do that just by going Tools, Scan Plugin Folders Quick, and it will run through that folder and it will figure out what's in there. And you'll see now that we've got all of these plugins available. Okay, so let's just try something else just so you can see. Let's install, I don't know, let's try Diva. You'll see this is a trial version of this plugin. I don't know, let's just choose that. And you can see we've got a different sound now. Okay. just to try something else. Piano. One tip with this dialog is you can just type the name of anything and it'll find matches. So let's put in this piano here. Okay, so that's a piano. For effects, you might want to put an effect on this afterwards. So for instance, let's say, I don't know, a Leslie effect. So if I was to now connect the stereo out, instead of going straight to the main speakers, send it to this Leslie effect. Okay, so you can see the effect being applied to that sound. Okay, just to cover off this panel a little bit, we've got here, this plugin is running. You can also put them into a suspended mode. If you've got lots of plugins and you're switching between them, suspending them can save some CPU load and get a bit more performance out of your computer. This one here bypasses audio effects. I'll cover that down here. This is the name of the plugin. Here's your preset selection, so you can choose your different presets as... That's the same as this selector here that I showed before. A gain slider. In here we've got a wet dry mix, pan sliders. This is the level indicator, so this is showing the output audio level of the plugin, and these indicators show MIDI input and output activity. So when I play a note, for example, you'll see these lighting up to say they're receiving MIDI and that they're sending MIDI. You can see the plugin here is receiving MIDI. This route here isn't actually needed because this doesn't accept MIDI. So you can see MIDI coming in, being passed to the plugin. Plugin is generating a sound. It's being sent to the Leslie is then sending it onto the speakers. Okay. I mentioned this button here. This is bypass, so you can hear Leslie effect there. Bypass it, and it's just a straight piano. The other thing you can do is use this wet dry mix. So this controls how much of the original signal versus how much of this Leslie simulator has been mixed in. So if I turn it right down, you see that's just the piano. Here there's partial Leslie effect and the full Leslie effect. Okay, so that's the basics of working with these plugin slots. The on-screen keyboard is not particularly useful for playing music, but it's very handy for auditioning plugins, for just checking out how they sound. If you've got a touch device, Microsoft Surface for example, you can play the on-screen keyboard just by tapping these notes with your fingers. It's multi-touch as well, so you can play chords if you need to. If you're using a mouse, it's a little bit more fiddly, but it's still kind of handy. You can simply just play a note. You can run scales like that. You can play different velocities according to where you tap. So if you play down here, you get a louder note than if you play up here. You can hold multiple notes on by using the control key. So if I've pressed the control key on my computer, you can see I can have 3 notes on at once. Press them again to turn them off. The other thing you can do is just press the A key to release all. And you can also play using your PC keyboard. So you'll see this octave 3 and 4 here are highlighted. If you press the Z key on your computer, that plays the bottom octave here. So Z, X, C, V, B, N, for example. And the upper range here you can play from the Q key. So Q, 2, W, 3, E, etc. Okay, you can change which channel you're playing here, which MIDI channel these notes are being sent on. You can also use what's called keyboard capture. So this little indicator here shows keyboard capture is on. And what that does is it lets you use these keys, the Z, X and the Q, W, E, R, T for up here, regardless of where the focus currently is. So for instance, if I had this piano open and I was tweaking these settings, I can continue to play using my on-screen keyboard. Okay, so that's just a handy tip if you're playing around with sounds and you just want to be able to play them while you're tweaking those dials. Okay, what's next? The next thing you might want to do is save all of this away. It's pretty standard. Just save, type in a name for your song, demo song, and then you can reload that later. through the recent menu or file open. It's pretty standard Windows stuff. I mentioned before bridging. So the idea behind bridging is to be able to use a 32-bit plugin in the 64-bit version of Cantabile and vice versa. Sometimes that's handy if you can't get all the plugins that you need on the right platform. So what you can do for that, if you go to, I'm not going to go through it in detail here, but if you go through the user guides and just scroll down to understanding 64-bit, in here there's an explanation of the difference between x64 and x86, which I've been talking about through this video, and also 64 versus 32-bit audio, which I mentioned before, which people often get confused between, especially when they're just getting started with this. So just here you'll see there's a link to JBridge. JBridge is developed by a third party, but Cantabile has built-in support for it. So if you have JBridge installed, Cantabile will detect it and it will automatically use it to load plugins from the other platform. I don't recommend using this unless you have to, simply because plugins loaded in the right platform are much more efficient. But JBridge is a good fallback for those cases where you can't get the plugin that you need on the right platform. Okay, and finally, when I first installed Cantabile here, we chose Cantabile Lite. If you want to try Performer or Solo, you can just choose change license here, and you can switch to one of the other versions of Cantabile. So for instance, if you wanted to try Cantabile Performer, you just double click here, it will want to restart, it will verify the license, continue, and you'll see now that we've got quite a lot more options here. We've got these extra panels. We've got recording, we've got set list and state management, let's say monitor, there's show notes, bindings, which let you create bindings between knobs and sliders on your keyboard to parameters in your plugins, so you can tweak the sounds as you're playing. And triggers let you do things like configure external synthesizers when a song's loaded, for example. There's a lot more stuff in here which I'm obviously not going to cover off now. Okay, I think that's about it for this video. I hope you found this useful. Go to the Cantabile software website, download it, have a play with it. And if you've got any questions, my contact details are there as well. Get in touch, I'm happy to answer questions. And I hope this was useful. Thanks for watching.